I'm trying things a little bit different today just because I want to try it and see if it works. This so far isn't my favorite way of doing things, but I want to get this out because our last recording of it didn't work very well. So I wanted to kind of see if we could get stuff out and honestly to get over to the actual studio to record these things. It's cold outside and I'd have to walk through the snow and all that kind of stuff. I'm just not feeling it. So let's see how this works, huh? I wanted to talk about cold emergencies, and we talk about like hypothermia pretty often. And oh yeah, you're going to put in, you're actively warm them, and you're going to put in chest tubes. You need like HPMKs, you need heaters and stuff like that. And that's well and good for like the guys that are truly whole body hypothermic. But what about the more kind of common stuff that we see? It's usually not that the person comes in. Sometimes it is that the person comes in with a temperature of 88 degrees or 80 degrees or something like that, and you see all kinds of EKG changes and stuff. What about the guys that just have peripheral injuries? So basically stuff that happens to your hands, your feet, your exposed areas. Those are ones that we may see maybe more often, or certainly they occur more commonly, even if we don't see them or recognize them right away. But what do you do about those things? That's what I want to kind of cover today. So I will begin with a story. David Pfeiffer, you know David Pfeiffer. Well, maybe you don't. He's kind of a quiet guy, not very outspoken, kind of keeps to himself, doesn't tell you anything about what he thinks about what's going on. But convinced me as part of this Red Star team that we're working on, this wilderness EMS team convinced me, hey, we're going to do essentially a rope tech class. You should come out and do it. So I thought, like, okay, yeah, sounds cool. Send me the thing. Oh yeah, good looking poster, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, look at that guy. They're managing that basket. I learned how to do that kind of stuff. Cool. Sign me up. And if you look at the tag, it's January 8th through 10th, and then 15th through 17th in Kentucky. And I don't know if you know Kentucky in the winter, but it's not a particularly warm place. It is not frozen from December through March by any means, or November through March. And there's not that much snowfall, but it's chilly to say the truth. To be completely honest, and it often is below freezing, and that happened to be the case on this weekend when we went out there. Certainly the guy managing the basket with a uh, t-shirt and nothing else on would feel cold, definitely, although it's not the blistering cold that you often feel. So we're out doing this training, and of course, as most training started with, there's some sort of didactic or uh, listening component that has to happen before you can really get into any of the hands-on stuff. So it's mid 20s, it's dark, it's cold, there's a little wind blowing. I start to feel like, oh God, I'm getting kind of cold here. Not so much that like my core is cold, but yeah, my hands maybe a little bit, but I got them in my pockets. My toes especially, they're getting pretty cold at this point. And at some point they stop really starting to feel a lot colder and just start hurting. Like, crap, well, this is bad. I've seen this before, and we have to be talking about cold management or something like that, and we pull a bag of LR from out of one of the gear bags, and it's got literally chunks of ice floating in it, like big pieces of ice floating in it. Like, well, that's not good. Um, something like that. That's not supposed to be that way. Okay, it pretty darn cold at that point. And Pfeiffer's going on about, oh yeah, whole body hypothermia, and you can get like Osborne waves, and he goes on to some of the cardiac stuff, and it starts talking about sensitivity and specificity. This is a test, and it's like, oh God, at this point, all I can kind of think is, Jesus Christ, my toes are cold. Um, and I go back to something that I have seen previously and have maybe mentioned previously. If you've been around, we need to start moving around and doing something. Otherwise, something bad's going to happen. So that kind of prompted me to remember to say we really haven't talked about, and we really don't talk about what you do to keep all your fingers and toes from getting numb and then eventually falling off, i.e., preventing the really bad cold injuries. So winter is not my favorite season, but winter's got its it's got its enchanting moments. Walking through a woods when it is snowy and quiet, certainly a sight to behold. But things do turn darker, and if you all of a sudden go from walking through woods to having stepped in a puddle and being a couple miles away from the ability to get your feet dry, that can become a sometimes really devastating injury for folks, depending on how far and what going up that mile involves. And then, of course, there are other dangers as well that you might encounter. So even minor injuries, minor cold related injuries, can become big problems depending on how many Yetis you run into. Now, people in general, if you look at folks that live in hot climates, we are able to kind of adapt ourselves often. Like we have ways that if you live out in the heat, we can kind of adapt the way our body physiologically reacts to heat to some extent. We don't really have that ability in places where it's cold. Our ability to deal with cold involves putting on more layers and adding things and technology, basically, be whether that technology is a fur-lined tent and coats and clothing and that sort of stuff, or whether it's heaters and synthetic insulation. We basically only have the only means we have to deal with the cold is to add insulation to us and make us not cold. So that's what you have to deal with when you're dealing with cold injuries. If you are outside and you don't have the ability to add insulation, you basically don't have a way to deal with cold other than to make yourself make more heat. So, what are the physiologic processes that go on when you start taking heat away from a body part? Well, let's say you take your hand and you have circulation going through your hand, as is denoted here in this fantastic drawing, and you put your hand in a 32-degree vat of ice, or let's say 32 degrees isn't going to do it, but let's say you've got some other liquid and you start dropping the temperature of your hand through this liquid bath. So you're initially going to find what we normally see, which is vasoconstriction. Your body realizes, hey, I don't want to shunt a bunch of warm blood out of that cold area because then I'm going to get cold. So it vasoconstricts, it tightens things up, and you decrease blood flow to that area as a means of conserving body heat. That goes on for a while, and that's all cool, the vasoconstriction phase. But after a few minutes, you may notice that actually, yeah, your hand initially gets kind of cold and sort of pale. But there is this reflex, it's called a hunting reflex, that as your body vasoconstricts to its maximum point, which is like tissue gets to be like 60 degrees or something like that, at that point, your body will actually realize, well, wait a minute, I'm going to lose that finger if I don't provide some blood flow to it. So it will go through this cycle of vasorelaxation and vasodilation again. So blood vessels constrict initially, and then you'll get some vasodilation and like shunting of blood. And then it'll vasoconstrict and shunt blood and then vasodilate again. All that happens over like 10-minute periods or so. So that's called the hunting reflex, which is, again, once your hand gets to its point of maximum vasoconstriction, you dilate again. And so you still have blood flow going through that tissue. But say the temperature of that tissue continues to fall. As it keeps getting colder and colder and colder and approaches that freezing temperature, you eventually start to, actually freeze despite your body's best efforts at preventing it. And when you freeze, you develop ice crystals in the tissues themselves, which are somewhat bad. And the demonstration of why ice crystals in tissue are sort of bad is the same as if you had left a bunch of Diet Coke in the back of your car. If you've ever done that in the middle of winter in like a really cold patch in Kentucky, you'll notice that when you come back, a lot of the Diet Coke doesn't exist anymore in cans. It's all over the back of the car itself, and it's this huge mess to clean up. Crystals, ice crystals, water crystals expand when they freeze. And when you freeze water in tissues, you disrupt the cell membranes, you physically damage things. All that is a problem, as well as the fact that at some point you're going to freeze blood physically and you can't get circulation, which means you can't get rid of waste products and you get necrosis and the tissues die because there is no blood flow. So, combination of ice crystals forming, which directly damages cell membranes, especially like capillary membranes, and then eventually you just get a complete lack of perfusion to that digit or that part of your hand or your foot or your cheek or whatever it is that's exposed. And by the way, tissues freeze at about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not actually 32, but it's not much below 32. So it does have to be cold enough for that to actually happen. It does have to be at or below 28 degrees. So if it is 33 degrees, physically your tissues cannot freeze. You can't get frostbite. So after you lose the amount of energy that's required to freeze the tissues to develop those ice crystals, tissue continues to fall, and eventually the tissue, if it's left out, will fall to ambient temperature. And if ambient temperature is negative 30 degrees and you just leave it there, eventually it falls to negative 30 degrees. And that's the way that getting cold sort of injures you. You can imagine that lack of blood flow to an area itself would be enough, as well as the mechanical damage that happens when you freeze things. Let's say, though, that somebody comes upon you, finds you, and finds your frozen finger and says, "Oh my gosh, we got to thaw that out." And so you plop it in a warm vat of water and you start freezing things. The reverse sort of happens. So you go from ambient temperature, nothing really changes until you actually get up to that freezing temperature of water again and start melting those ice crystals about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, the ice crystals melt and you start to get blood flow back into the area, somewhat sluggish at first, but still there as you melt all that water. Once you get blood flow back into the area, the blood encounters these real leaky like capillaries basically, and when you get leaky capillaries you get water expanding out into the interstitial space and you get blister formation and that kind of stuff. Once you get rewarming, that's when you start to see a lot of edema, and a lot of blister formation gets really pronounced. You don't notice it so much when the actual frostbite, when the freezing is actually occurring, because blood, the problem is blood can't really get up there. But once it gets thawed a bit more, then you start to see the edema and the blister formation. If it's deep enough in there, that can actually erode down into like capillaries. You can get like hemorrhagic blisters. Once you get edema and blisters, this sends your body a message that like, oh, inflammation needs to happen here. There's something going on. We need to send immune cells to it. And so you get, like interleukins and all those things that people talk about, and you get a big inflammatory response to the area. Unfortunately, once you get inflammation in the area, you increase venous stasis and you increase the chance of thrombosis. And that can be either real small vessel thrombosis, little tiny near microscopic clots that clog up just the little tiny capillary beds, or that can be larger scale thrombosis, like whole, main digital arteries and that sort of thing can develop thrombosis in it, which is why sometimes you'll see folks talk about, as treatment for really advanced frostbite, do we need to do like catheter directed TPA into one of those arteries? And eventually, whatever part doesn't get blood flow back to it, whatever part is clotted off too much, will sort of mummify. It'll shrivel down, become necrotic, and eventually usually self-amputate as long as it doesn't get infected. And you'll see that kind of happen when these things demarcate. You get the black fingers. That's dead tissue, dead mummified tissue. You might ask, well, who does this normally happen to? In most things, including like heat injuries and hypothermia and that kind of stuff, you may think, well, okay, the old and the young, the super old and the super young, are the most likely to get this because they have the least amount of reserve. And that's true for most disease processes, but not so much here, because usually the super young and the super old are inside and not exposed to real freezing temperatures. It could happen if they were outside, but just not real common. The most common group that's going to get it is middle-aged folks. It happens much more commonly in men. Frostbite itself, the freezing injuries happen much more commonly in men. The non-freezing injuries a little bit more commonly in women. And it generally happens in areas where it's, actually cold for a prolonged period of time. So this is just an illustrative map. Where do you think the most common like hypothermia injuries in the United States are? Well, the actual most common like exposure cold weather injuries occur in Colorado, which is, it's got its cold spots. But Arizona, where it's pretty warm most of the time, and in the Carolinas, and that's because people it's a combination of people being out plus the potentiality for um, changes in altitude, which changes temperature. So while it is generally warm in Arizona, if you get up on top of a mountain, it can be quite cool. Same thing in Colorado. In the middle of the summer, if you go up to like Pikes Peak, it's chilly, um, just because of the elevation change. And folks aren't always accustomed to that. So while that is for most of the like cold weather stuff where people's body temperature drops, not so much for the not for like frostbite, which tends to occur up in places like Michigan, Minnesota, where it is below freezing for a prolonged period of time. You can't get frostbite, you can't get a freezing injury unless it's actually freezing temperature outside. Or you have a significant amount of wind in order to to cool that tissue off. So you're going to see this more in the northern climes, but it could happen in places, like Atlanta. If a large snowstorm were to move through generally warm and pretty temperate Atlanta, if you've got a homeless guy who is not dressed for the weather and doesn't have any way to warm his fingers up, and they get wet and they get cold, and then the wind blows through, he could develop pretty significant frostbite injury in the course of a night. So you could see this kind of anywhere, but more common up in the northern climes. Let's take the case of Cincinnati itself, where the average winter temperature is something like 38 degrees. It's cold, but not that cold. It's, again, not freezing most of the time. What are the injuries you might kind of see? Well, let's say that you're called for a young woman. She was out hiking during the day. It was cold, but it was, 35, something like that. Feet got a little bit wet, but not soaked by any means. Hike was maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours long. Her toes were cold when she went back to her car. And about 12 hours later, after, changing her socks, warming up and everything and not feeling too bad, she develops a feeling of burning in her feet, and notices that she has these blue markings on them. They sort of look like bruises. They're a little bit red. There's some swelling associated with it. She's had this one other time before. So this is prototypical chilblains or Pernio. The problem here is disruption of your capillaries. So because of the vasospasm that you get when your feet get cold, or it can be your fingers too, in some folks, the capillary response to it is more pronounced than in other folks, and it leads to a little bit of microvascular destruction, which is why you get that like bruising look to it. So this is Pernio. It's a non-freezing injury. It's not that the toes, or not that not the toes in this case got frozen. It's that they got cold, and then the vasospasm led to some disordered microvascular response to it. So another something you might see, let's take again, let's say this is a 28-year-old woman. She's outdoorsy person, was out hiking on the Appalachian Trail. Let's say that it got dark. They got turned around one day. They ended up kind of taking going a wrong direction for about a day or so. Got pretty wet and stuck out in a snowstorm. So everything got pretty saturated. It never did really get below freezing, but she's been out kind of stuck in the woods and finally walked into town complaining of pain primarily in her feet. And she looks like, let's say, the person on the left-hand side of the screen there. You notice that when you assess her, that the feet are kind of white on cold, and similar to what you see on the right hand side there on the soles. The bottoms are fairly pale and kind of numb. As they get rewarmed, they start to become intensely painful, have a burning quality to it, sort of similar to what we saw with Pernio there a minute ago. But a little bit different story in that this wasn't just a couple of hours out in the cold. This has been a couple of days in the moist, damp cold for a while. So as things kind of go, what you'll see is that you can actually get some sloughing of skin as the days go on. She continues to have this sort of intense burning pain in her feet throughout. This is a good example of how you might get trench foot, or immersion foot in the modern day. Now, it's probably worth noting that the one on the right is much more close to what actual trench foot probably looks like. These tend to be times when the person is unable to get out of their wet shoes and it's cold but not freezing. So you never get freezing injury of it. The tissues never actually get below 32 or 28 degrees. But they are, for a long period of time, relatively long period of time, at least on the order of probably hours, although people argue about that. At least probably hours to days of the same cold, wet environment. So, trench foot, you may have heard, named after the soldiers in World War I who were stuck in wet, muddy trenches, unable to change their socks, unable to dry their feet out, and it was cold. And subsequently, they developed trench foot because they were in the trench. This has to do with more like the hunting reflex we talked about, that pattern of vasoconstriction, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, vasodilation. That's probably the pathogenesis of this. Again, it's not a freezing injury. It's that you've had cold, moist skin, so you get all macerated. You've had, poor circulation to it, if nothing else, and your feet don't like that over a prolonged period of time. So while they didn't actually freeze, they just didn't get a whole lot of blood flow for kind of a long period of time. And then usually there's some mechanical injury to that as well, in that you usually have to walk on trench foot because you're stuck out in the snow, or you're in a trench, or you're stuck on the Appalachian Trail, or something like that. So there's usually an element of mechanical trauma that goes along with it as well. Worth noting too that if you Google trench foot, what comes up on the internet is pictures that look a lot like the picture on the left. The person on the right legitimately has, this is a cold weather injury from someone who is homeless and was unable to change their socks. This is legit trench foot. These people show up sometimes with what appear to be like real thready pulses in their feet, and you may say, okay, they've got vascular occlusion. Well, they don't have vascular occlusion. It's just that they have thready pulses because of the trench foot, because that's what happens when they start to rewarm. They do have pulses, but they're markedly diminished when the rewarming process starts. What is identified as trench foot usually is actually not. Usually it's just my feet got wet and they got blistered, they got irritated, which is more what I probably believe this is. Now, could I say that it couldn't be true trench foot? No, probably not. But the clues are that, like, first of all, the person was clearly wearing sandals, as you can tell from the markings on their feet, which wouldn't normally happen when it's 45 degrees outside. I suspect this is probably more just blistering and like local irritation from being wet, but not true trench foot, like you see on the right there. Now, another type of, and by the way, the treatment for trench foot: dry your feet, keep your feet dry. Giving somebody warm socks, or not even warm socks, but dry socks, so that they at least have an extra pair that they can change into if they're out on the street, or if they're out on a trail or something like that. Keeping your feet dry is the primary helper with that. um, so here is another example of an injury that you might have. This person, let's say they called 911 because they walked out into the cold air and they weren't out there 5 minutes, and they noticed that their fingertips turned white and they got numb. And then when they rewarm, they get painful and somewhat swollen. Otherwise, it again is not that cold. It's just a kind of a wintertime day, and they were only out for a couple of minutes. And you may say, well, that's awfully early to get actual, frostbite, to completely lose circulation. This is a vascular phenomenon known as Raynaud's phenomenon. This is something that happens. It has a predilection for women. So you'll see it more commonly in women. And it is a brief exposure. This could even be like, I dipped my hands in cold water, and it happened. They get vasospasm in their in their fingers, and subsequently you get this blanching, and they are, for into all intents and purposes, ischemic over that time period. Now this resolves generally, but it can be really bothersome, especially if it happens frequently. There's not much to do with it other than just kind of rewarm and let the vasospasm go away. They do talk about some vasodilators that may help, but sort of outside the realm of what EMS needs. For us, This is Raynaud's phenomenon, and it'll get better.